So everyone, welcome back to Orthodoxy 201. Tonight, we are actually going to conclude the section on the Logos. We've been looking recently at major scientific discoveries in the last 100 or so years that point to the belief in God as the creator and sustainer and redeemer of the universe. Most recently, we have been looking at the theory of evolution. And we have seen that that theory is actually not scientifically based. It has become ideologically based because the theory as proposed by Darwin has proven to be simply false based upon the evidence that has been coming in over the last 100 years. And it's evidence that is mounting every day on the side of what we might call intelligent design. And we'll speak a little bit about that topic today. So last week, we began with our wrap-up of the theory of evolution, looking at junk DNA. And this was a concept that was developed by people who believed in the theory of evolution. They thought that there would be a lot of junk DNA or data that would be in the DNA that had no purpose, or perhaps did have purpose in the past. It's vestiges of the process of DNA happening over generations, hundreds, thousands, millions of years. And that amount of junk DNA was believed to be massive. But we have found that actually that's not the case. In fact, it's very difficult to find junk DNA at all. That the DNA that we have come to understand all has a purpose, all has a function. So it's all functional and not junk. And this was anticipated by those who believed that life on this planet was designed, that it was designed by a super intellect, and that intellect encoded in DNA all of the instructions for how life was to form and to be sustained. We also then transitioned to look at the fossil record, which Darwin had believed would vindicate his theory, that they would find, having done archaeological digs all over the world, that all of the existing species could be traced back to a common ancestor, and that the fossil record would bear witness to this, that you would find proof in that. Of course, the opposite has been found, that the fossil record shows unique animal groups that have existed for much time and have largely remained the same. We don't see the idea of common ancestry at all within the fossil record. And there are reasons for that. We talked about genetic mutations, natural selection, and time not being creative. It doesn't lead to the formation of new types of animal groups or forms of anatomy, but it simply makes slight modifications to that which already exists, that which was already formed with massive amounts of DNA, and corresponding to that DNA, the anatomical chemical structure that would be necessary to support that form of life. So we see a continuance of these animal groups in the fossil record and not the common ancestry that was proposed by Darwin. We also spoke about the Cambrian explosion, and this was a time period where numerous forms of life appeared, and these were complex forms of life that showed no precursor organisms in the fossil record. They came on the scene almost like a poof event, that there was nothing before them, and they show up in the fossil record, and they are fully formed, and they are complex, and there is great diversity. So the Cambrian explosion is one of those examples. There are others. That's probably the most notable, where we find all of these organisms appearing in the fossil record, again, without precursors. Then we talked about how species will change over time, remaining within certain boundaries. And those boundaries are defined by the ancestor organism. So in this case, the gray wolf, which had all of the genetic information for the various different types of canines that would be its descendants. So the gray wolf has all of the DNA, and then over time, that DNA, through genetic mutations, begins to degrade. And through natural selection, you have modifications within that category of wolves or canines. And you have different forms of that organism, that wolf or that canine or that dog emerging. But they're emerging not because something new is being created, but because DNA is being lost, that the organism is being downgraded. So this is another example of how evolution is not creative. It's actually better to call what happens in that process of genetic mutation, natural selection, and time, devolution, not evolution, right? So it's the degradation of an organism. And there is, again, boundaries for these organisms because no new information is being created. No new anatomical structures are being generated. You simply have the deformation of the ancestor organism, in this case, again, the gray wolf. And then we spoke about quote unquote missing links. And this is what Darwin had anticipated that would be found in the fossil record, showing a connection between the common ancestor organism and all different forms of life. In the imagery shown here, you see the apes, then kind of Neanderthals, and then the human being as we know them today. But one of the images isn't loading, right? And in fact, there would be a series of images that are not loading because they're not simply found in the fossil record. There's no evidence that these creatures, these transitional forms, ever existed. And that's, again, laid out in the fossil record, but it also corresponds to our understanding now of genetic code and DNA, right? Because there is no progression, there's no evolution from lesser organisms to higher organisms. It's the reverse of that. Higher organisms degrade and become lesser organisms. So what was proposed in evolution was hoped to be proved by these missing links, which haven't shown up. The only ones that have shown up, and sometimes you'll hear about this in the news, and it's happened for decades, people have claimed to find missing links. They've discovered the next kind of connection between chimpanzees and human beings, or whatever the case would be. And articles are written, journals are published, and people are all super excited about finding this missing link. And then you find out actually it was a fraud, that it was the mixture of, for instance, the skull of an ape and the jaw of a human being, or something of that sort. The top image there is kind of more alien, right, than human, but that also is a forgery, right? In the bottom image, I don't know what creature that is, but it looks like half fish, half Freddy Krueger, or I don't know, something like that. But these missing links are reported to be found, and if you visit the local museum, you'll probably see kind of models of the missing links, but there are no fossil records. There's no evidence of these missing links. Okay, and since we've been talking about evolution and the Big Bang and the modern scientific approach to the timeline of the universe, one being of 13.8 billion years, some say longer than that now, that has been changing over time, right? It's sometimes getting longer, sometimes shorter, but usually longer because the great complexity in the universe would have to take a long time for that to manifest itself. And we've already established, though, looking at the science of how, again, DNA works, or how the universe is so finely tuned, that it's not really a matter of time, because the improbability is so great that you could have an infinite amount of time almost, and you still wouldn't have the universe as we have it. You wouldn't have life as we have it. So this model of the old universe though, came about because of the ideology of undirected natural processes being behind everything, rather than a creative intelligence and power that we see in God. So we spoke a little bit about two polarized timelines. One is that 13.8 billion years, and the other would be kind of what's summarized as the 6 days of creation, being 6 literal days. And we've said that the Orthodox Church doesn't actually have an official dogma or doctrine on the age of the universe, that it falls under the realm of theologumena. So that means that you can have a pious opinion on however old or young you think the universe might be. That doesn't mean you can believe whatever you want if it's not based upon legitimate science and legitimate theology, of course. And that's very important for us to remember. So when we look at the old universe model, the 13.8 billion years, the question is, how legitimate is the science that is behind that? And we've already talked about how the laws of physics break down as the universe would be compacting, everything compacting into no space. It doesn't make sense. And everything can come from nothing. Now order can come from disorder. Right? It's not a very scientific theory. It's not very logical. It's not very rational. So it's kind of a pseudoscience, which is again based upon the necessity of lengthy time periods to mask how undirected natural processes are unable to be observed to bring forth order and life and what we see in the universe. On the other side, we have to be careful not to fall into kind of a pseudo-theology where we understand the book of Genesis, in especially the early portion of the book of Genesis that speaks to us about the creation of the world, in a literalistic fundamentalist way, right? And that's often what happens when you have people competing for the narrative with those who are atheistic or naturalistic in the old universe model. People try to push back and they go with the young earth model. And they'll argue for a literal 6 days of creation, 24 hours. And while that could be possible, we aren't going to try and limit God and say that that couldn't happen. That's also not how the fathers or how we today really read the book of Genesis, because the book of Genesis is teaching us about things that are really beyond our comprehension. We can't understand how things can come from non-being into existence, right? Ex nihilo. We can't understand how that works. We can't understand how time begins, because what would be before time? We would just count back in the negative, and that's still a timeline. There are certain limitations that the human mind has to comprehend things of a scientific nature, but also of a theological nature. We are not God. So when God speaks to us about how he creates the world, he speaks to us in a poetic form. And we do well to understand that to be mysterious and to leave it in the realm of mystery. Many of the heresies that have happened in Christianity have been because people tried to dissect and bring down from heaven the mysteries of God. So for instance, the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, which is a mystery, how the three could be one, or the incarnation, how God could become man. These doctrines, people tried to peer into and to understand and to dissect and to explain. And when they did, they fell into heresy. And the same thing could happen to us when we look at creation and the book of Genesis. I'll give you an example. So like on day 4, for instance, we have the creation of the sun and the moon. Well, a 24-hour period is the period in which the Earth rotates on its axis in relation to the sun, right? That's how the 24 hours work. But for 3 days before that, before the sun was created, you would still have a 24-hour period? Well, maybe not. These are matters that God knows that we cannot prove or present evidence for nor are they necessary for us to have the right relationship with God, which is one of humility and one of rendering glory to God and realizing that we are not God, first and foremost. So there are certain things that we're just not going to be able to understand, and that's okay. We don't have to understand them. Likewise, we do remember when the scientific revolution happened, and it was again pioneered by believers, it started to go south when people started to over-explain or over-dogmatize things that they didn't quite understand. And that's one of the reasons why people turned away from a theological understanding of the universe, right? And that's why science turned more naturalistic and atheistic, because Christians were in the scholastic period over defining things and presenting what really was, in its essence, a kind of a pseudo theology rather than real theology. So we do well to be careful of that. Okay, then we looked a little bit at some of the scientific findings, though, that do point to a younger Earth. And we looked at biological evidence, geological evidence, and astronomical evidence. And then finally, we finished with anthropological evidence. So things with regard to, for instance, soft tissue and DNA found in dinosaur fossils, which would be impossible for dinosaurs to be 60-something million years old, right? We also looked at how trees are found within rock strata that are supposedly laid out over millions of years, right? And the trees, no tree lives a million years. No living thing lives a million years. We looked also at how carbon-14 is present in a number of different elements, that it's not supposed to be there if these elements are really that old. The formation of canyons, for instance, the Providence Canyon and Burlingame Canyon, which are relatively young, and they show that canyons can be formed through massive amounts of water. And this is very interesting finding, because when we see, for instance, the Grand Canyon, and if you look at some of the research done on the Noah's flood, you can see how the Grand Canyon was most likely laid out in a rapid succession of water coming in and receding, coming in and receding. And there's a lot of very fascinating research that's been done on that. I mentioned the resource creation.com, and maybe some of you had a chance to go and take a look at some of that material. We then looked at astronomical evidence, and some of this was simply just above my head, and that's a very poor pun or joke to reference outer space, right? But there's different ways to interpret the data that we see, and some of it points perhaps to a longer, older Earth, some to a shorter, younger Earth and universe. So we looked at some of that information. And then we spent a little bit more time looking at human history evidence. And that deals with population growth and the emergence of agriculture just some almost 10,000 years ago, the decay of the human genome, which is able to be, through simulation, processed to the point where you anticipate, based upon our current degradation of the human genome, and you walked it back on the average rate of those genetic mutations, you would end up with human beings that emerged around the time of the biblical timeline of Adam and Eve. Likewise, if you look at the mitochondrial DNA and information with regarding to the Y chromosome, likewise points back to around the same time period to the original man and the original woman. So this is really fascinating information that is now being made known, and we do well to be aware of it and to share this information with other people. Then we looked also at language families. We looked at the flood myths that have been found in many of the ancient civilizations. There are 15 listed here, and those language families, of course, could tie back into the Tower of Babel. So there's a lot more information. I mentioned again, creation.com, for those who are really interested in this type of thing. And now we begin kind of with our wrap up. Today's new slide begins with 4 miracles of atheism. And can I ask for Suzanne, can you start us off, please?
4 miracles of atheism. 1, getting something from nothing. 2, getting life from non-life. 3, getting order from chaos. 4, getting the immaterial from physical matter. These miracles are not literal miracles in the religious sense, but are rather points where current scientific explanations are incomplete, or where naturalistic explanations are seen by some as requiring a leap of faith. These points are often used in arguments suggesting that belief in atheism involves its own set of unproven assumptions. The origin of the universe. The Big Bang Theory describes the expansion of the universe from an initial singularity, but the question of what caused the Big Bang or what preceded it remains a profound mystery. The fine-tuning of the universe. The universe's physical constants and laws appear finely tuned to allow the existence of life. Small changes in these constants could make life impossible. The origin of life and diversity. How did life arise from non-living matter? The process by which inanimate molecules developed into complex, self-replicating organisms is not understood. This transition, known as abiogenesis, remains one of science's great mysteries. Likewise, there is no naturalistic explanation for the appearance of the vast amounts of information so ingeniously stored in DNA. The emergence of consciousness. How did conscious experience arise from physical processes in the brain? Can we trust the reasoning mind if it is nothing more than a random series of chemical reactions?
Thank you, Suzanne. So sometimes in debates or in arguments between theists, believers in God, and atheists, you'll have the accusation made that you theists, you believers in God, believe in miracles. And like, we all know that miracles don't exist. A miracle is basically when you have the laws of nature set aside, so to speak, and something happens that is extraordinary, something that doesn't correspond to the normal processes and functioning of the created order. But a miracle is really more than that, because the whole of the created order is itself a miracle, right? The very fact that there is something rather than nothing, it is a miracle. And the fact that the laws exists and they govern the universe, and there's such fine-tuning in physics, that there's mathematics underpinning the universe, that life has emerged and has such beauty and diversity, and there's so much information that's coded at the very beginning. Where did that information come from? All of this is really a miracle. Everything in life is a miracle. We just have become accustomed to it, and it becomes something that seems to us as ordinary, but all of life is extraordinary. Everything is extraordinary. And that accusation that's made against believers that you believe in miracles could be turned against the atheist, because everything that we see in created order has to come from somewhere. There has to be some kind of a source. We believe that that source is God. He is the one who works miracles. That's what he does, right? That he has the intellect, he has the power, he has the love, he has the wisdom, and he works it. And he brings about what you see in our universe, in our world, in our life, in our experience. But for the atheist, they have this miraculous world and this life, but they have no one to work the miracle. And that's a real problem, because the natural processes that are observed, they don't explain how things came from non-existence into being, how life has emerged. where the information came from. These natural processes do not describe that because that's not their function. That's not what they do. They perpetuate what God has already created. They are laws that sustain the universe, not create. And there's a massive difference between the two. The creation of the universe has no scientific explanation where these things come from. All science is able to do, and science is a wonderful discipline, but it is limited. What science is able to observe is the continuity and the perpetual nature of the universe. Those things that are the same from generation to generation, but it's not able to go back and observe something that has happened in the past, let alone things of an extraordinary nature, for instance, coming from non-existence into being. Science can only theorize about that. And if you're doing naturalistic science, and there's two versions of science, right? There's the early scientific revolution, the science of believers, and then there's the atheistic version of science. That atheistic version of science has no miracle worker. There's no one to bring this universe into existence and to give it order and to put that information there. Where on the side of the theist, the believer, there is a miracle worker, right? Who establishes everything and sustains everything, and ultimately we believe will redeem everything. So if someone says you're a theist, you believe in miracles, you should acknowledge that fully and say, absolutely. And we have a miracle worker. How do things work on your side? Where does everything come from on your side? You have the miracles of getting something from nothing, getting life from non-life, order from chaos, the immaterial from physical matter. How does that work? And there won't be an answer, because the only answer to that is actually God. The only one who can bring things from non-existence into being is the creator, by definition. That's what the creator is, right? And then also this final thing that's mentioned here on the slide, the emergence of consciousness. So if there is no intellect, if there's no mind, if there's no personhood, if there's no real consciousness, that all of that is simply just chemicals bouncing around in our heads that bring about feelings and thoughts that give us an appearance of rationality or intellect or consciousness, but only an appearance, that all we are simply the chain reaction of dominoes falling from the Big Bang. There's no free will, there's no personhood, there's no real relationships that we have. None of that really exists, because all we are the collision of atoms set in motion from the Big Bang. If that's the case, if that's what we truly believe, the very thought that would be the case itself would be irrational. It would be just another domino falling. It wouldn't be something that was formed from an intellect or from rationality. It would be simply a chemical reaction. So it's kind of like the image of cutting off the limb on which you're sitting. If you believe in a materialist universe where there really is just an undirected series of natural processes that are happening at random, that governs, that thought, that ideology governs also your own mind. So your own mind is not rational. It only has the appearance of rationality. Just like the world, they might say, it has the appearance of design, but it's not really designed, right? So you have to be logically consistent. And that's one of the major problems that people are realizing today with the new atheists, that they have no basis upon which to make their claims that they are rational, because they're simply just undirected material natural processes that are at the very core and the heart of their thoughts. All right, so those are the four miracles of atheism. And I mentioned this gentleman, we had some quotes from him, Dr. Stephen Meyer, in previous sessions. He has written a number of books. His latest book is The Return of the God Hypothesis. I highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in this subject. So do look that up if you're interested. Georgianne, can you take this slide for us, please?
Yes, Stephen Meyer, a prominent advocate for intelligent design, ID, holds a PhD in the philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge, where his dissertation focused on the history of scientific ideas about the origin of life and the methodology of the natural sciences. He argues that numerous scientific discoveries over the last 200 years support the idea that life and the universe are the result of intelligent design rather than undirected processes. Dr. Myers states, in the 19th century, a consensus arose that there were two fundamental realities within space and time, matter and energy. In the 20th century, it was realized that matter and energy are not sufficient in and of themselves. To them must be added the essential reality of information.
Thank you, Georgianne. So information, how key it is. We often say that we're in the information age, right? And that's not just because of computers and technology and the amount of information that's at our hands, but also that we're finding that information has been coded into the very fabric of the universe, most especially life, but also, again, the great constants of physics and the mathematics behind all of that. Information is a key component. And the question is, where does this information come from? So, Marion, can you take this one for us, please?
Intelligent design. We know from uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis for all scientific reasoning, that information, especially in a digital or alphabet form, always arises from an intelligent source. Whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or a section of software, or even information embedded in a radio signal, if you find information and you trace it back to its source, you always come to a mind, not a material process. The unparalleled complexity of this information in the universe and in life indicates a super intelligent source. God is now invoked not because of the things that we don't understand, but because of the things that we do understand. The beginning of the universe, the mathematical precision in the fine-tuning of the universe, the immense complexity and overwhelming amount of information in DNA. Science, when properly conducted, once again points to a transcendent, intelligent cause that is responsible for the origin and design of the universe and life. Stephen Meyer.
Thank you, Marion. So he, again, is one of the proponents of intelligent design, very eloquent. He's appeared on a number of different TV shows, interviewed by a variety of different media personalities. He's debated numerous people and, again, written a number of different books, most recently, The Return of the God Hypothesis. So very fine advocate for intelligent design. And as we have been saying, the science really is weighing in, and it's pointing to God, who we understand is the Logos, right? The meaning, the purpose, the rationale, the word that calls things from non-existence into being, that orders, he commanded, they were created, right? That it's God, the Logos, who is behind everything and in everything, as the Logi are created by him and are the underpinnings of the universe. So the scientific observation that the universe is expanding, which means it had a beginning, points to the Logos, right? That it wasn't always here, but it came into being. And if something comes into being, that means it begins at a time, and someone or something has to make the choice. It has to have free will, and it has to have the power to bring things from non-existence into being, and the intellect to order the universe as it is, right? Okay, and that we see also in the finely tuned universe, which has such magnitude of precision with these physical and mathematical constants that it's mind-blowing. It's really beyond the level of our own abilities to fine-tune anything in such a precise fashion. If you wanted to measure something or modify the weight of something or the height of something or the temperature of something, we don't have the instrumentation to modify these things at such a finely tuned manner, such great precision. And this we see in all of the different laws and constants that underpin the material universe. Okay, the origin of life, how organisms which have such great complexity in their cells could be formed at random. All of this we've kind of looked at with great detail in previous sessions, but those two things, the origin of life together with the complexity of the cell, and you might add to that the information in DNA, speak to us as powerfully as the origin and the finely tuned universe, that for the need of a creator, of a designer, of a super intellect who has the power to not just envision this, but to implement it. And then again, the fossil record, which if you're looking for someone to write the history of the world, no one really is able to do that in a way that's convincing, because you have different perspectives on things, different opinions, right? They say history is written by the victors, right? And they don't tell the full story. Well, the fossil record tells the full story. The fossil record shows us how life exists in previous generations. And what we see there is, again, the continuity of animal groups that came on the scene through some kind of creative act and not through undirected natural processes. Okay, so for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. I love that quote, and it really speaks to us about what's happened over the last 200-300 years, right? The early scientists knew more about the universe in a fundamental way, in a very real way, than the atheist scientists know about the universe today, right? Because our knowledge is always going to be limited. There's only so much data that we can amass about this massive universe, how much we can hold in our minds, right? We're always going to have limitations on that. But the one thing that we should be certain of is that this universe has a creator. It has a sustainer. And the early scientists, even though they didn't have all the information, all the data wasn't in, they were theologians. They believed in God. And again, they were maybe amateurish by modern day scientific standards with regard to their instrumentation and their knowledge and things like that. But they understood the fundamental first principles. They understood the logos. They believed in the logos. And that is sometimes absent from our modern day scientists who have so much information and evidence that has come in that simply just points to the logos. So it is kind of a difficult time for the atheist scientist, but it could be a really wonderful time, right? Because it could be a time when someone goes from darkness to the light, right? From falsehood to truth, to broken relationship with God, to union with him. And that ultimately is what God is looking for, right? And he discloses himself in part through the created order. So natural theology should lead man to God, right? Studying nature, studying the universe. And that's exactly what's happening. Even though at first there's resistance or there's a turning away from God, in time, as the evidence mounts, people are won over. A number of atheists have now become believers. People have turned away from the idea of undirected natural processes to acknowledge intelligent design. And that's a glorious thing. So we cheer them on in their discoveries. We hope and pray for their fuller understanding of not just the creation, but the creator. And we rejoice in that. We also shouldn't be triumphalistic about the fact that we're believers, right? This quote kind of is a little bit poking fun at the fact that theologians are already at the top of the mountain, right? And we are believers, like we're theists, and maybe we can have a little fun too, but we also should be humble because we have been privileged to be given the gift of faith, right? Faith is a gift too, and we've received it, and we do well to be grateful to God for that, but also not to lord it over others. We have been given this great gift to see not just the creation, but the creator. And we welcome everybody else to come up the mountain too, no matter how long it takes. So some of those theologians are quoted here. I have 4 quotes here that are kind of short, and then I want to look at 2 more quotes in the next slide. So are we back to Suzanne?
The Logos of God is the inner teacher who illuminates the mind and heart of every person, guiding us toward the truth. St. Augustine of Hippo. The Logos of God is the ground of all speech, and without him, nothing true can be said. He is the truth by which we speak the truth. St. Gregory of Nazianzus. The Logos of God is both the principle of all creation and the divine reason that unites everything in himself. The Logos is the source of harmony and unity. St. Maximus the Confessor. For Christ is the Logos, the word of which all men are partakers, and those who lived according to reason are Christians, even though they have been thought atheists. St. Justin Martyr.
Thank you, Suzanne. Of all those quotes, I think I love the St. Justin Martyr quote the best, right? And it's so true. The scriptures say in the Gospel of St. John that Christ is the true light that enlightens every man that comes into the world. Any truth that we are able to receive and hold in whatever capacity in our mind and in our heart and speak with our tongue and share with the world, that is participation in the Logos. And even as believers, by the way, we don't realize the full gravity of what that means. We don't. Atheists certainly don't acknowledge God in that way. But many times we might come up with a great idea or we figure something out and we kind of credit ourselves. But the only way that we are figuring things out or we're coming to realizations or revelations is by coming more and more into closer and closer union with the Logos, right? There's no truth that we could ever have within our minds or within our hearts that is somehow separate from the Logos. As we become more enlightened, as we become more knowledgeable, we become more united to the Logos. That's the nature of how this works. And likewise, if we going in the opposite direction, we're distancing ourselves from the Logos. So we all have this relationship just by being in creation to our Creator, by being people made in God's image and likeness. We have this relationship with God. And we do well to remember that this relationship is something that we should keep in the foremost of our minds, right? That we should not forget God. True ignorance is the forgetfulness of God. It's not knowing things, like not having all the facts or something like that. Ignorance is when we fall away from the remembrance of God. That's the worst type of ignorance. Okay, so that quote, though, from St. Justin Martyr, I think is hopefully very encouraging for us as Christians, knowing that God is at work in the people who don't acknowledge him, right? That he's still trying to enlighten them and lead them more and more to the knowledge of truth and eternal life. Okay, now we've got 2 more quotes, and this is St. Maximus and St. Irenaeus of Lyon. So, Georgianne?
The Logos of God, who created all things and sustains all things, entered into his creation, not as an outsider, but as its center and life. He is the radiance of divine wisdom, who orders all things with beauty and goodness. In the mystery of his incarnation, the Logos becomes the principle that unites heaven and earth, divinity and humanity, in his one person. Through him, all things return to their source, the Father, who in love sent his Son to draw all of creation into perfect harmony and union with himself. St. Maximus the Confessor, Ambigua. The Logos, the only begotten Son of God, is the one through whom all things were made, and in whom all things are held together. He came to his own, summing up in himself the long line of humanity, restoring to life what had been lost, and renewing us in the image of the Father. By his incarnation, he revealed the invisible God, and through his life and death, he renewed all creation, making peace through the blood of his cross. The Logos, who is the image of the invisible God, became what we are, so that we might share in what he is. Saint Irenaeus of Lyons, Against Heresies.
Thank you, Georgiana. So these are really beautiful quotes, aren't they? The fathers write so well about the most important things. Christ is not only the creator, but he's also the redeemer. And he redeems creation, not by some wave of the magic wand, but by entering into creation, by filling creation with himself. He enters into this world. He enters into man by becoming fully man. He even descends into the lowest Hades, as St. Basil the Great, so that he might fill all things with himself, right? He loosed the pangs of death. He arose on the third day. All of this was to redeem and to restore the created order in himself, because he is the Logos, and all of creation is filled with the Logi. And though we have fallen away from God, away from the Logos, away from the inner principles, the Logi in which we were created, Christ enters once again into us, and through that union with us, restores us and redeems us and unites us once again to our high calling, to be made in God's image and likeness, to share in his communion, in his life, right? And this is his continued work in the church, and it's his work that he will do on the last day as well, because in the next age, we hear that God will be all and in all. Right? This is where we are all heading, to real union with God. The only question for us, whenever we talk about the next age, is to what degree do we want that? Or to what degree are we running from that? To what degree do we embrace that union with God, or do we seek to avoid that? And that's what makes the next age heaven or hell for us. But in the next age, God will be all and in all, that there won't be corruption and death anymore. All of that will be overcome, and will be restored to what we're called to be in God. And hopefully we all will enjoy that to the greatest degree possible, right? And because that's what we were made for. That you would have to be irrational not to enjoy union with the Logos, right? But that's the nature of how hell works. Hell is irrational, right? You've been given good things, you've been given eternal life, but you reject it, and you want evil things, and you want death. So there is work to be done. Is work that God is doing as creator, as redeemer, as the one who inaugurates the next age. But there's work to be done on our part too, and that's to accept God within us, and to rejoice in him, and to give him glory, and thereby to enter into heaven. So again, these beautiful quotes by St. Maximus and St. Irenaeus. I would like to close this segment today with looking at something from Jordan Peterson and from Jonathan Pageau, who are modern day commentators on these subjects. So Marian, can you take this one from Jordan Peterson, please?
Reconciliation through the Logos. Christ is the Logos, the word of truth incarnate, the principle that unites heaven and earth, God and man, and brings about the ultimate reconciliation. If there's no overarching uniting principle, then there's nothing that stops everything from fragmenting into chaos. If you lose the uniting principle that transcends us all, you fragment into conflict and chaos, and each person's subjective perspective becomes paramount. There's nothing left to mediate between individuals or groups. Postmodernism assumes that there's an infinite number of ways of interpreting the world and no way of ordering them. Without a hierarchy, there's no value, no orientation, and no path forward. If we're not guided by something greater than ourselves, then nihilism fills the void. And with nihilism comes despair and a dangerous drift toward totalitarianism or ideological possession. When people lose their connection to the transcendent, they often turn to ideological systems to fill the void. But ideologies are dangerous because they offer overly simplistic answers to life's complex problems. Without a higher guiding principle, people fall prey to totalizing belief systems. When we abandon the logos, we abandon the idea that there's something transcendent about truth and order. We lose the very principle that allows us to live in harmony with one another and with reality. Jordan Peterson.
Thank you, Marion. So he says it very beautifully. It's the overarching principle, the transcendent oneness is what the philosophers were seeking, right? They were seeking the logos that was to call them to higher and higher things, the things that were more true, more good, more beautiful, right? And that all of mankind, they believed, had this desire within them for the truth, for that which is good, for that which is beautiful. And of course, the Jews were awaiting this in the coming of the Messiah, God with us, Emmanuel. And we Christians have been privileged to receive this revelation in the church. And for many centuries, it was this Christian faith that was the overarching unity in the world that united peoples of different tribes and cultures, right? There's neither Jew nor Greek, barbarian or Scythian, right? United different nation states. Everyone acknowledged that the good, the true, the beautiful, the logos reigned over all, and we all willingly should submit ourselves and aspire to union with that logos, and that his commandments, his laws would govern us and lead us to peace and unity with one another and to flourishing and ultimately to life eternal. And that was the unifying principle, which has largely been lost. Not entirely, but largely it has been lost. And in the absence of that principle that we could aspire to, that could inspire us, that could unite us naturally, because we're all drawn to that, in the absence of God, that throne had to be filled with something else. And whatever it would be filled with would be less than God. It wouldn't be something that would be acceptable to the human being. And for that reason, it would be impartial, it would be imperfect, and it would need to be forced. Here enters power and tyranny, right? This is where you see Marxism filling in after nihilism, right? And now we're in a world where there's just constant competition. And it's not, there's no path out of this because it's constant warfare, constant fighting. That's what Marxism envisioned, right? That it would be one class versus the next. And then as time passed, you would just reverse the roles. The one who was in the lower class is now upper class, and upper class is now lower class, but they still keep fighting. And they still stay in their ideological camps. And there's this constant battle. The only thing that could unite would not be power. It would not be power, but it would be freedom. Freedom to choose to love. Freedom to choose that which is absolute, that which is good, true, and beautiful, that which unites. Right? And that very principle is again in philosophy, the logos, and in Judaism, the coming of the Messiah, and in Christianity, we understand that Messiah to be Jesus Christ himself, right? So the logos is the only way to true unity. All other versions of unity are by compulsion and by force, and they're temporary, they're not lasting. So in the church, though, we have this vision of Christ as the one who reigns over all, the Pantocrator. So are we back to Suzanne?
Christ the Pantocrator. The Christ Pantocrator is a central image in Orthodox Christian iconography and theology, portraying Christ as the ruler of all. Pantocrator means almighty or all-powerful. This depiction of Christ emphasizes his divine authority and his role as both judge and savior of the world. Found in the domes of many Orthodox churches, the Pantocrator icon is a visual representation of Christ as the cosmic king, the one who holds all creation together through his divine will and order. Pantocrator icon also highlights Christ as the Logos, the Word of God made flesh, through whom all things were created. This connection to the Logos underlines Christ's role as the ordering principle of the universe. In Orthodox theology, the Logos is the source of all meaning, truth, and life, and the Pantocrator represents this reality in visual form.
Thank you, Suzanne. So that's a beautiful image of a church, isn't it? With Christ at the top, at the pinnacle, in the heavens, on the throne with the Father and the Spirit, and ruling over all. And his rule, by the way, is not a rule of tyranny. That's the wonderful thing about God's almighty power. He uses his power and his kingship, his lordship, right, to make his peasants into nobles, into kings themselves, right, into people who are called to rule together with him, in union with him, to sit on the throne with the Father and the Spirit, overcoming as he himself has overcome, right, as we hear in the book of Revelation. That all of that is opened to us, and we have this natural inclination and calling towards that destiny, right, to be united to God, and through him to be united with one another. And there can be no substitute to that, right? There can be no alternative to that. That's why Jesus Christ is the only way, the only truth, the only life, right? No one comes to the Father except through him. And there is this oneness in God, and we're called to be one. Doesn't the Lord say his high priestly prayer is that all might be one, as he is in the Father and the Father in him, that all might be made perfectly one? That is the calling that we have been given, the destiny that we have. And how beautiful it is to be united with everyone else to that which is supremely, utterly transcendent, infinitely good, true, and beautiful. Right? That is our calling, and God is bringing that about. So we have so much really to rejoice in. And the church makes this tangible and visible to us every single time we enter into that building, and we see its architecture, we see its iconography, we hear the hymns, we have the incense, we have the sacraments, we're united together as the body of Christ. We're participating in that. So this world is dark and it's divided, and there's chaos and anarchy and rebelliousness and atheism and all of that. But in the church, we're already participating in the kingdom of God, and it's a glorious thing. So this will be the last slide for today. I realize we're a little bit over on time, but let's look at what Jonathan Pageau has to say. And it's more about this image of Christ as the Pantocrator, the Christ in the dome above all. So Georgianne?
Christ in the dome is like the sun in the sky, the center of everything. He is the one in whom all things hold together. Christ is the Logos, not just as a word spoken, but as the pattern by which everything exists, the reason for everything, and the one through whom everything holds together. The dome in church architecture symbolizes the cosmos, and placing Christ at the top reveals how everything in creation is directed towards him. Christ, the Pantocrator, in the dome is often surrounded by light, symbolizing that he is the light of the world. His divine presence in the church reflects the truth that his light shines into every corner of creation, bringing life, order, and meaning. When we enter an Orthodox church and see Christ Pantocrator, we are entering a space that reflects the true order of the universe, with Christ at the center of all being. The world reveals its meaning through symbols, and at the heart of these symbols is the Logos. Every symbol participates in this greater truth, pointing to the ultimate reality of Christ. The Orthodox Church architecture is hierarchical, with Christ at the pinnacle. Below him are the angels, saints, and prophets, reminding us of the structure of creation, where the heavens, earth, and even the underworld are ordered around Christ, the divine Logos. When we look up at Christ in the dome, we are reminded that our life is an ascent towards God. The architecture is designed to lift our gaze, to turn us away from earthly distractions, and to focus our attention on Christ, who is the source and goal of our existence. The church building is not just a gathering place. It is a sacred space that reflects the entire universe. In this space, Christ reigns as the cosmic king, and we, as his people, participate in his order and beauty. Jonathan Pajot.
Thank you, Georgina. So beautifully said by Jonathan Pajot, and so beautifully illustrated for us in the architecture and iconography of the church. And it's wonderful that we not only can look at the created order through science and understand that there is this logos behind the world as the creator, but also to understand through the church that he is also the Redeemer, and he's calling us to union with him and to that next age, and we participate even now in the church. There's so much to rejoice in, to be thankful for, and to welcome others into as well. That's one of the things about the Logos, right? The Logos is drawing all things, all men to himself. When the Son of Man is lifted up, he will draw all men to himself. And that's the more we are united to that Logos, the more we're going to be drawing others as well, right? That's our function, to unite our family, our friends, those on our side of the political aisle, those on the opposite side, our enemies, everybody, to unite everybody ultimately to God through the church, through Christ. Right? That's our calling. And it sometimes might seem intimidating and sometimes might seem hard that we can't accomplish that. And the truth is, it's really a miracle for that to be accomplished. But we have a miracle worker, right? That's how this whole thing works. The same one who's active within us, drawing us to him, will be active in others as well, if we're willing to cooperate with him and we're willing to accept all of the goodness, truth, and beauty that he offers to us. And we have that natural calling. So things are really stacked on our side, right, to bring the world to God in Christ through the Holy Spirit. We really have all of the advantages that you could ever possibly want. We often don't look at it that way, though, right? And it's usually because we lose sight of the Logos and his presence within the world, within our brothers and sisters, within ourselves. So God help us to always see the Logos and to understand that in him we have life and we have it more abundantly. So next time we'll move to the next segment, and that'll be on Revelation.